Welcome. This module is focusing on intervention programs in reading, and this is part one of this module. So in this module, you're going to learn, in this part, you're going to learn how intervention programs support students and teachers, and what intervention options there are for teaching reading. So this whole course is really about intensive intervention for students with reading disability or students experiencing reading difficulties. And these are students who, by definition, need more than even excellent classroom reading instruction. Students that need supplemental and additional interventions of the highest quality and the highest intensity to make successful learning gains. So this module really is about the kind of tools and the practices and the materials and the programs that help us provide that kind of highly intensive, high quality instruction in intervention. So let's just situate intervention in a couple of different models and frameworks for teaching reading. So one of them is we can think about MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, response to intervention frameworks. And we think about intervention coming in tier 2, supplemental intervention, and then also in tier 3, individualized interventions. So again, we're talking about materials and tools and programs that sort of serve as the foundation for interventions within MTSS and RTI. And of course, in our DBI model, we also start with an intervention program, a validated intervention program at the very beginning of the model. And so this idea about a validated intervention program, the choice of the word program was intentional here. So why are we talking about a program? And the thing I think that's really important to think about is what we don't want to have to do is reinvent the wheel. We don't have to do it, and we don't want to do it. The sort of basis for an evidence-based profession, which we're working towards in education, is to really be able to rely on the experience and the wisdom and the knowledge of all the teachers and researchers that have come before us. We want to be able to draw on that knowledge in a way that we can make decisions about what we do based on evidence of effectiveness. We can kind of start with something that we already know is highly likely to work with our students. And also, I think it's really important to think about that when people ask us questions like parents or administrators, why did you choose to do what you're doing? How did you select that practice? We don't want to have to say things like, I'm not sure, I just came up with it, or I don't really know, it seemed like a good thing to do. We want to be able to say that this was a highly intentional choice that was driven by understanding the needs of the student and identifying a practice or a program that has evidence of working with students similar to those. So we can kind of start from a farther place along than kind of starting from scratch. The other thing about in teaching reading is that we're not really talking about this wheel here. We're actually talking about this wheel here. There's a commercial that's on TV these days where this woman has bought a new car, and every time she looks in the rearview mirror, there's a whole team of German engineers sitting in the back seat. And the sort of point of the commercial is that the car kind of comes with this built-in engineering, all these features that this whole team of engineers has kind of worked on to build into this car. And that's what we want for good intervention programs in reading. That there's a team of really knowledgeable program developers, instructional designers, researchers, experts in the field that are putting together all these pieces of an intervention program to really a sort of high-performing tool that can help support us with intervention. So we want to think about kind of programs that provide us with these tools at a starting place for highly effective, high-quality, intensive intervention. So I want to talk a little bit about why intervention programs support teachers and what intervention programs do for you as a teacher. One of the things is that it schedules, organizes, and integrates content over time. One of the most difficult things about providing highly intensive, high-quality reading intervention is thinking about a scope and sequence, or thinking about how skills are going to progress over time. And a program, that's one of the main features of an architecture of a good intervention program. Programs also select examples for you. Again, a hard thing to do when you're delivering intervention is coming up with good examples that really demonstrate the concept. And it takes time to think of those examples. In a program, they're carefully embedded and chosen for you. Programs break down skills that you can more easily model and demonstrate them. So there really is already this kind of task analysis that's going on with important reading skills and strategies. Programs also provide language for providing clear explanations to reduce confusion. The way we communicate information is really important for students with reading difficulties and reading disability. And by providing language that's built into a program that's already very clear and consistent across the program is going to go a long way to prevent confusion. And finally, it provides all learning materials for you. You don't have to kind of search around at night coming up with materials and trying to find lesson plans online. So all of these things are built into the architecture of a good intervention program. So if you start with a good intervention program, what does this allow you to do as a teacher? A couple of things are, one, is it really focuses on teaching content, not designing it. You can then worry about how you're teaching, not designing it. What teachers are really good at is teaching and instruction. Teachers really shouldn't be expected to be curriculum designers or instructional designers. So you don't have to worry about the design and the putting everything together. You can really focus on teaching. You can also focus on how students are responding, so you can correct or expand or elaborate. You don't have to be kind of thinking about what you're going to say next, what are you going to do next, what example is next. All that's kind of built in. So you can, once you become familiar with the program, you can really sort of become unglued from the program, from the wording, from the examples, and really focus in on how kids are responding. Programs also allow us to maintain a fast, appropriate pace. We know that kids learn more when they're highly engaged, and that the pace is fast, and kids are getting a lot of opportunities to respond. And the kind of time that we save from pulling things together and developing things, we can instead use for database decision making and individualization. So we don't have to be developing these lessons. We can focus on the other kinds of things that teachers are expert at. Finally, intervention programs support students. So some things that intervention programs allow students to do and how they support student success. One is that they can be highly aligned to student needs. They can be built in a way that we can ensure that the kind of skills that are built into these programs are highly aligned with the needs of the students that we're working with. Another really important thing is providing consistency across teachers and grades. Right? Even if it's the same content in good instructional practice, if different teachers are using different instructional language and different vocabulary, students can be confused. So using a similar program that has consistency built in provides that kind of common language across teachers and grades. And finally, the most important thing, these are practices and programs that have evidence of effectiveness. We can feel good about using these programs because of the research that supports their efficacy, again, with students similar to the students we're working with. So hopefully that kind of helped you think a little bit about some of the reasons why we focus on intervention programs and how programs both support teachers and students. But that being the case, I also want to talk a little bit about what are different intervention options for teaching reading, because there are things other than programs, and we don't have great programs in every area. So I want to talk a little bit about intervention options for teaching reading. Again, the place that we want to start is evidence-supported programs. And I'm going to use the term evidence-supported here instead of evidence-based or research-based. Just because sometimes evidence-based has a very defined definition, and I want to talk more generally about programs that have high-quality evidence supporting those. So you can kind of call it whatever you want, but for this module, I'm going to be talking about evidence-supported programs. But sometimes we don't have a program, and instead we need to think about evidence-supported practices, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that differs from an evidence-supported program. And finally, there may not be evidence, there may not be that kind of evidence that exists for particular practices or programs, but they still may be good choices if we don't have other choices. And we might call these promising programs or practice. And I'm going to go through and talk about each one of these and give some examples. So the first type of intervention option that we've been talking about is an evidence-supported program. And again, that's the kind of place that we're sort of starting from. That would be our choice of if that was something that was available. And some things of the characteristics of evidence-based programs is, one is they can focus on a single component like reading fluency or phonemic awareness, or they could be multi-components. They can include an emphasis on, say, phonics and comprehension, or fluency and vocabulary. We find programs that have a different emphasis can be single component or multi-component. An important thing about a program is it really is complete, right? So it includes multiple lessons, it includes a scope and sequence, detailed lesson plans. So it's not just one lesson or one routine, but it includes a kind of whole structured sequence of lessons and routines that go through a whole kind of scope and sequence, right? So it's kind of all there. And finally, there's been research that has evaluated the program implemented with fidelity, right? So that what's actually been researched is the same exact materials and the same scope and sequence and the same lessons that are available to teachers to implement in schools. And that's an important piece here, which is the exact way that it was researched in the study is the same way that the materials are presented in the program. So we could think a little bit about some examples of what an evidence-supported program might look like and kind of go through the features. So Sound Partners, there's no reason that I picked this. It's just an example of an evidence-based program. We see that this is sort of a single component intervention. It says a tutoring program in phonics-based early reading. This is a program that's designed as a tutoring program for kids in K through 2nd grade. We also see that it comes with a scope and sequence. So you can't really see this, but this sort of shows lessons 51 through 60 and talks about kind of how these skills build over time and how things are introduced and reviewed so that the sequence of lessons has been really thought through carefully. And also, it comes with very specific lesson plans, so it gives the interventionist or the tutor or the teacher real guidance and direction about how they should implement each lesson. And finally, this is a program that has evidence of effectiveness. So on a website, Evidence for ESSA, which is a site that evaluates the research evidence about different interventions in reading and math, we see that they've been given this rating of strong evidence based on 4 studies with a large number of students. And we see that the average effect size is 0.58, which tells us that there were meaningful improvements in student reading outcomes based on implementing this program, right? So this meets all the kind of features and characteristics of an evidence-supported program. And there's lots of different evidence-supported programs in reading and beginning reading. And just to kind of show you a little bit of some of the variation of what these look like, there are programs that come with a lot of stuff. This is a Lindemood Bell program that's a phonics phonemic awareness program. And you can see that there's kits and materials and a lot that kind of comes with it to support teachers. But also there's evidence-based programs that really are mostly a teacher guide. So for example, Rewards is an intervention program that teaches multi-syllabic word reading strategies. This is primarily a sort of teacher implementation book. We also have intervention programs that are multi-component. So Wilson is a reading intervention program that includes phonics and phonemic awareness and some comprehension and fluency. And so we would think of it as a multi-component kind of long-term intervention. Where on the other hand, an intervention like Read Naturally focuses primarily and specifically on reading fluency. Right, so we can see that there's multiple intervention programs that kind of have different levels of these kinds of features. So we talked about what is an evidence-supported program. We could also talk about what are evidence-supported practices. So in reading and in any area, sometimes there isn't necessarily a great evidence-supported program in that area. And sometimes there's strategies or practices which aren't built into a whole program, but still have evidence of effectiveness, right? So an evidence-supported practice would be a strategy or an approach that has evidence of effectiveness. So these are the kind of things that might have general guidelines, but no scope and sequence or detailed lesson plans. So it kind of describes an overall approach or a strategy, but doesn't kind of rise to that level of a whole kind of comprehensive program that goes along with it. So these things more likely kind of outline an approach like explicit instruction. So there's a lot of research about the benefits of explicit instruction, but that's not really a program, right? That's an approach. You can also think about a strategy. So we know that asking and answering questions and comprehension leads to improvements in understanding and comprehension. Again, that's a kind of general strategy, not sort of outlined in a specific program. Or sometimes we can even talk about content, right? So we know that teaching phonemic awareness in focusing instruction, intervention, and phonemic awareness leads to gains in reading outcomes. So that's something that we know that by teaching that, it results in accelerated reading outcomes. But again, that's not a program. So these are all things that we might think about as an evidence-supported practice. And the key piece here is that research has evaluated this practice, but not necessarily the materials that are available to teachers. So again, they probably in a study on explicit instruction, there's lots of different ways to provide explicit instruction, and teachers or interventionists in schools don't have those exact same materials. They're just going to be sort of implementing or using that particular practice without this sort of detailed guidance that would come with the program. So some examples of what we think about as evidence-supported practice. One of the best places to find these are in the IES What Works Clearinghouse practice guides. And we're going to be talking some more about these websites and resources that I'm talking about in this part of the module in a lot more detail in part 2 and part 3. So there is a practice guide for improving reading comprehension in kindergarten through 3rd grade. And what this practice guide has done is had a panel of experts go through and review the research on comprehension instruction. And what they've done is they've come out with recommendations that have different levels of evidence. So for example, one of their recommendations is to teach students how to use reading comprehension strategies. And this has strong evidence of effectiveness. So we know that this is an effective approach to improving comprehension. But in the practice guide, they don't really say, here's the program you should use. They give sort of general guidelines, right? So if the comprehension strategy was summarizing or retelling, it says, the description is that students briefly describe orally or in writing the main points of what they read. And basically the kind of directions or activities that they provide to teachers is that you should do things like ask students to describe in their own words to a partner or a teacher to describe the text, what happened, and then kind of following up and asking questions, things like what comes next or what else did the passage say. And so again, those are sort of general guidelines, but not a specific kind of program to do this. Just some more examples of what evidence-supported practices might look like. Here's another website that we'll talk about later, but this is Teaching LD, which is a website for the Division for Learning Disabilities from the Council for Exceptional Children. And they have practice alerts which talk about the evidence supporting different kinds of practices for teaching students with disabilities. And so here's some examples of some of the practices or strategies that they sort of say go for, which means there's evidence to support you doing these practices in your classroom. So some of these practices include things like fluency instruction or graphic organizers or direct instruction. So again, they're not identifying programs with this kind of evidence, or they're identifying strategies or approaches. So you might not have a program for teaching these things, but instead, maybe you have a textbook or a resource book, something like the Teaching Reading Source Book that has lesson plans in it. So this is a book that has a lesson plan for recognizing story structure, right, which is using graphic organizer for thinking about the text structure of narrative text. And it also comes with a graphic organizer like a story map that you can use. So again, this is sort of a single lesson plan that teachers could use that we would feel confident using because there's evidence supporting this idea of both using comprehension strategies and using graphic organizers. So that would be a kind of some examples of evidence-supported practices. And again, there's some areas in reading where we might not have access to as many effective evaluated intervention programs, so we might have to rely on evidence-supported practices in some cases. Finally, we can think about this kind of other sort of tier of practices that we might consider a promising program or practice. So these are programs or practices that are consistent with existing theory and research on reading development and reading instruction. So when you look at it as someone that knows about reading, it looks good, right? Like it's teaching the kinds of things that we'd want to teach. It includes a kind of focus on effective principles of instruction, like lots of examples and explicit instruction. And so everything about it seems right. It looks really good. It's a strategy or a program or a practice that seems consistent with what we know about what the research says. But there may be little existing research demonstrating positive effects of the program or practice. So this is important here because just because there is little existing research on a program or practice doesn't mean that it's not an effective practice. It could be a highly effective practice, but there still isn't necessarily rigorous research yet kind of showing the effectiveness. So for example, you might, in your school, or have access to a program, something like this, a phonics or a spelling program that has a lot of great materials, really good resources. If you look at it, it looks very similar to other programs that have evidence. And the scope and sequence looks good, and again, it's comparable to other things that we've seen in studies or in the What Works Clearinghouse or the National Center for Intensive Interventions. But then when we look to see about the evidence, so for example, in evidence for ESSA, we see that there's no studies that met the inclusion requirements. So again, this doesn't mean that this is an effective program, but it means that there hasn't been research that's met the high standards of rigor to be included in this kind of summary of interventions on this website. And similarly, if we look on the What Works Clearinghouse, Saxon Phonics, again, we see that there was no studies of Saxon Phonics were found that fell within the scope of the beginning reading review protocol. So this is a kind of a continuum, I guess, of intervention options for teaching reading. And there's sort of pros and cons of each one. We already really talked about the pros of evidence-supported programs. And there really is not a whole lot of downside of a good evidence-supported program if there's one that's available. So I guess the only sort of cons would be, one is there's a little bit less flexibility for kind of designing things as you go, or making kind of adjustments based on how students are responding. But actually, that's probably not really a con, because as part of the DBI process, we know that we can make ongoing adjustments, even in evidence-supported programs, in a way that doesn't reduce the effectiveness of the program, but makes it more responsive to students. And that's kind of what this whole course is about, right? So in later modules, we'll talk about how to make adjustments and refinements to programs based on student response. Some pros of an evidence-supported practice. The main pro is that there's evidence supporting this. And it also does give us access to some strategies and approaches where we don't have an evidence-based program within that area. So for example, in reading, there's lots of programs around teaching phonics and code-based skills. There's less programs for teaching things like comprehension or oral language or vocabulary. So sometimes we have to rely on evidence-supported practices because there isn't a program available. The downside, or the cons of an evidence-supported practice, might be that we really don't have this kind of detailed scope and sequence. So teachers have to put a lot of work into how to kind of design this over time, how to build a 6, 8, 10-week kind of program of lessons when we only have maybe a sort of general guidelines on what that might look like. The other thing is we don't necessarily know what it means to implement that with fidelity. So if there are multiple teachers implementing a practice, they would have to get together and really agree on what those guidelines are to ensure consistency across teachers. So again, for a promising program or a practice, the pros for that is, again, we might not have availability of anything else. There might not be sort of research that kind of can guide our decisions on the kinds of materials or tools that we are using. Again, the significant downside is that it requires much more, there's sort of much more weight on the teacher for being able to really describe why we made that decision to use that program or practice. Really be able to talk about how it aligns with what we know about teaching reading and reading development, and how it's similar to other kind of practices or programs. So for the activity for this part of this module is to kind of look at examples of different kinds of practices for teaching reading, different intervention options, and determining whether we think these are an evidence-supported program, an evidence-supported practice, or a promising program or practice. So we're going to do a couple of these together, and then there'll be an activity that you'll be doing independently in your workbook. So take a look at these 3 examples of intervention options for teaching reading, and decide whether you think each one of these is either an evidence-based program, an evidence-supported practice, or a promising program or practice. So I'll just give you a few minutes to kind of look through these and decide how you would label each of these. All right, I've given you some wait time so we can go over these together. So the first one is a program called Phonics Foundations, and this is a phonics program with a clear scope and sequence and detailed lesson plans. So this is definitely a program, not a practice or a strategy. But we don't really have any information here about what the research is supporting this program. So if we don't have any research or there isn't research available, we would talk about this as a promising program or practice. If we had evidence available that we could find that supports this, rigorous evidence, we would be an evidence-supported program. But because we don't have that sort of information in this, we would sort of say that this was a promising program. So the second example, earlier interventions in reading, this is a phonics program reviewed favorably by What Works Clearinghouse. So based on the information we have here, we see that it's both a program, it's comprehensive, but also it's reviewed favorably by the What Works Clearinghouse, which gives us evidence that there are rigorous studies supporting its effectiveness. And the last example, question-answer relationship, QAR. This is a effective comprehension strategy evaluated in multiple peer-reviewed journals. So this would be an evidence-supported practice because we don't have information about a comprehensive program for teaching this strategy. Instead, we would have sort of guidelines from the research about that this is an effective strategy in itself. We would have to do some work figuring out how we would implement it in schools with kids and how we might do it over time. All right, so activity for this part is in your workbook, and you will have some examples of different types of practices and intervention options. And you're going to make some decisions about whether you think each one is an evidence-based or evidence-supported program, evidence-supported practice, or a promising program or practice. So that's the end of part one. Thanks very much.